Mertz and the Conservatives will be more willing to give Ukraine these Taurus long-range cruise missiles, which the Ukrainians have been wanting for ages, and which would give them an effective conventional deep strike capability against Russian military targets. The Germans were very reluctant in the previous government to do that, and we'll see if Merz does it. What also Merz has said, intriguingly, Philip, is that he's no longer going to go public on which weapons Germany actually supplies to Ukraine, which suggests that he may feel that if he keeps it more secretive, he's got scope to manoeuvre in giving Ukraine more weapons.
Well, it's VE Day for the Ukrainians as well. But Zalinsky came in very quickly and said, no, we're not going to do 72 hours. Let's make this 30 days. Because he said we can't agree anything serious in 3, 5, or 7 days. Do you think he's right in that? You've been involved in sort of ceasefires and negotiations.
Yes, of course, because it's very difficult to negotiate if the fighting is continuing, although that's what Russia likes to do. And you remember, Philip, after Russia first annexed Crimea back in 2014 and went into eastern Ukraine, we had this so-called Minsk process, is what diplomats call it, where Putin was very happy for years to continue the fighting, albeit at a much lower level, much lower tempo than what we see today, while European leaders were going to Moscow or meeting in Normandy, hosted by France, to try to figure out some kind of ceasefire. So the Russians are very adept at the idea of pretending to talk and trying to push forward on the battlefield at the same time. But of course, from somebody like Zalinsky's point of view, it's very difficult to negotiate. If immediately you've started, the Russians send an Oresnik ballistic missile against the shopping center in Lvov and kill 100 people with the massive sort of media impact that would have, and also Zalinsky felt that this time round, pushing for a minimum 30-day ceasefire before negotiating was something where he had a lot of international support. You remember he had the Europeans lined up. They were in Kiev over the weekend, Keir Starmer. You saw that. He also thought that he had the Trump administration, which had sort of swung more behind Kiev in the wake of the deal on the minerals. And the US was resuming arms shipments to Ukraine, albeit modestly. He felt, now for once, I've got the transatlantic partners on my side to really get tough on Putin and, put sanctions on, really put him under pressure. And therefore I can push for this 60-day ceasefire. And of course, it was due to come into effect yesterday, but we see from the 100 drones that Russia fired against Ukraine that that's not the case. And the Americans seem to have backed off from that now by calling for talks without the ceasefire as a precondition.
Putin's response to Zalinsky was, let's do talks at the end of May. Zalinsky's response back after this meeting between Starmer, Macron, Tusk, Mertz, and then by video conference, the leaders of the coalition, the willing, was no, let's do it this Thursday coming. They then seem to have got Trump on side as well. They got collectively, they had this discussion before phoning Trump and making this public statement of Trump. Do you think this was a masterstroke of diplomacy by Starmer, Macron, Tusk, and Mertz? And within this, the new boy in the block is Merz, the new German chancellor. Do you think he's changing the dynamics within Europe?
Yes, he's certainly taking a tougher line on Ukraine, a more enthusiastic line on European defence, a greater willingness to work with France on European defence than was the case with the previous coalition under Olaf Scholz. And the hope, I think, of course, in Kiev is that because he's taking a harder line, Mertz and the Conservatives will be more willing to give Ukraine these Taurus long-range cruise missiles, which the Ukrainians have been wanting for ages, and which would give them an effective conventional deep strike capability against Russian military targets. The Germans were very reluctant in the previous government to do that, and we'll see if Merz does it. What also Merz has said, intriguingly, Philip, is that he's no longer going to go public on which weapons Germany actually supplies to Ukraine, which suggests that he may feel that if he keeps it more secretive, he's got scope to manoeuvre in giving Ukraine more weapons.
Is that him outmanoeuvring the AfD?
Yeah, well, at least they're not in power, not yet. Let's see. But yes, I mean, I think the fact that Mertz is now joining the coalition, which you remember before was very much a Franco-British affair. The fact that Germany is there now, with its significant sort of military power, its military budget, its industrial capability, is important. I mean, one other thing, Philip, worth mentioning is that the companies which are moving the fastest at the moment in the defense industry, to start ramping up tank production, ammunition production, are the German companies like Rheinmetall, for example, Klaus Mate Wittmann, and so on. If Germany is more willing to pull Ukraine into those defense contracts, for tank upgrades, for ammunition, to get those German companies to invest more in Ukraine's domestic defense industry, which is where certain European countries like Denmark are now putting the emphasis, that could be a big contribution too. So I think, yes, it certainly put more sort of vigor in the spine of the Europeans. But coming back to the first part of your question, I think probably the Europeans would have been frustrated at the end of their weekend visit to Kiev, because, as I said, they thought they had Trump lined up, for heavy package of sanctions on Russia, a deadline of Monday for Putin to agree to the ceasefire. The Americans also demanding that the ceasefire should be the precondition of talks. So, Ukraine, US, Europe, for the first time in a long, long time, in alignment. And then, of course, Putin, who knows how to divide the West, he's the master at doing that, has his midnight press conference, suggests direct talks with no preconditions, i.e. no ceasefire. And Trump immediately says to Zelensky, you've got to go to Istanbul without your ceasefire. The Russian view is always, let's talk first, and maybe there'll be a ceasefire later on down the line. So I think, in a way, what was looking good on Saturday, unfortunately, had been largely undone by Sunday.
You're a communications professional. Vladimir Putin to have call an international press conference at midnight Moscow time, that he then starts almost 2 hours too late, after what had happened with the coalition of the willing and Trump seemingly coming on side. He was clearly riled, was he not?
I think so, yes. I think he recognized exactly, he's no fool, that he saw suddenly, the Americans taking a much tougher line. He saw that, for example, the US Congress, the Senate, is now preparing a package of sanctions, including Republicans, not just Democrats, which in fact suggests that, the customers of Russian oil might have to pay a 500% tariff, so-called secondary sanctions, which would obliterate the Russian oil market, which they need, as you know, Philip, to fund a lot of their military operations and defense production at the moment. He saw Trump taking a much tougher line against Russia. For the first time, American diplomats were even saying that, it was a Russian aggression against Ukraine, rather than a war that sort of came out of nowhere and in which both sides were sort of equally guilty, which had been a little bit the narrative up until then as well. And I think, yes, Putin recognized that, he needed to sort of try to get Trump to swing back more towards, if not a pro-Russian position, but a more sort of neutral in the middle kind of position. And he then offered those direct talks, which he'd always been reluctant in the past to have, because he doesn't like Zalinsky. He doesn't really want to negotiate with Zalinsky. And of course, he wanted Ukraine to be in a situation where the talks would really be a Ukrainian surrender before Putin would turn up in person to talk to Zelensky. So yes, I think Russia was on the back foot, but Putin, as always, hopes to do something which will make Trump take a more equidistant position, and we'll see. Of course, it's a high stakes gamble though, because if the talks go ahead on Thursday, whether Putin shows up or not, and Russia clearly is again making these maximalist, no compromise demands on territory, on denazification of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, NATO withdrawing its forces from Eastern Europe and all of that kind of stuff, then Zelensky may be able to say to Trump, "Oh, you can see, it's totally impossible to negotiate with this person. He's not interested in any kind of compromise," and hope that the Americans will then swing back more behind the Ukrainians. So it's a high stakes game, I think, for both sides.
But do you think Zelensky's playing this well? Because he's turned around and said he's willing for face-to-face meeting with Putin. He's very clearly said he will be there on Thursday himself, but he's also clearly said that he will only meet Putin. Now, I've seen in the Kyiv press this morning reports to say that the Russians are sending Dmitry Medvedev who is the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, as to lead the negotiations. Now, they haven't quite said that Putin isn't going to come, but are these talks going to fall apart before they even started?
Well, I think something will take place in Istanbul on Thursday, because the Turks who have been doing the behind-the-scenes diplomacy, Erdogan in particular, talking to both the Ukrainians and the Russians yesterday, the Turks invested heavily in it, and Putin having said Russia is willing to go, they can't really cancel, and the Ukrainians will show up too. So there will be something, although I'm not expecting much to come out of it. I think from Putin's point of view, yes, he was caught off guard by the very clever way in which Zalinsky immediately turned the table and said, well, you have to come in person then, if you're really behind this. I'm going to go, so I expect you to go.
Well, do you think if Trump turns up, that'll force Putin's hand as well?
Well, it would, but then Putin would have to be there. I don't think Trump would turn up simply for a bunch of diplomats around the table. But so I think Zelensky was quick out of the starting blocks on that one. I mean, I think what we've had over the last couple of months is that both the Russian president and the Ukrainian president have been desperate to keep the favor of the United States, and therefore desperate to show that they're not the spoiler. They're not the ones who are holding up the talks. And I think from Zelensky's point of view, he had no choice, because we all remember back in February that humiliating meeting in the White House. Since then, the Ukrainians have worked really hard to get back in the good favors of Trump. A good meeting in the Vatican, the minerals deal, as I've mentioned, the willingness to talk directly to the Russians, which they ruled out before because they passed a law to stop them talking directly to the Russians as long as Russia was occupying their territory. They don't, of course, want to endanger that relationship, having so painfully tried to reestablish it. And of course, it's provided some good dividends for Ukraine. For example, last week, the Americans were talking about taking a Patriot air defense system out of Israel and giving it to the Ukrainians. There's been a resumption of limited military aid, intelligence, and so on. So I think Zelensky, whatever he thinks are the realistic chances of a serious negotiation, feels that he's got to go through the motions at the very least and show up in Istanbul.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be amongst the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership at the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs, or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.